Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Mr Chair.
Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. The major problem with this piece of legislation is not what it does, but that it doesn't do it well enough. And the main problem that we in New Zealand First see with it, we will continue to support the bill, but we are disappointed in it. And the major problem is that issue about non-uniform insulation standards, because this bill does mean that properties built after 1978 with insulation standards that were in force at that time will forever be permanently exempted from modern insulation standards, forever exempted from that. And that's completely unacceptable to us. We would expect that over time all properties should have to come up to those standards. Now, I listened to what the Minister said about that, and the excuse that he gave why he would allow that situation to continue to occur in the future under this bill is that he said that more than, I forget the exact figure, but more than 80% of the required, the modern insulation standard would be achieved by the 1978 standard. But I, first of all, don't accept that that's the case. I don't accept that that is anything more than just an estimate, and the reality is that that will be very patchy. There will be some well under that percentage and some, no doubt, considerably better than it. And I built my home shortly after that, and I remember investigating standards and looking at what other people were doing, and I found that there was a huge array of different solutions to insulation of homes. So I don't accept factually what the Minister said. And the other excuse that members opposite on the other side of the House have given for not requiring all properties to come up to modern 2008 standards is the cost. And the claim was made that if that cost was imposed on people with properties built after 1978, then that would mean significant rent increases, and that would be a problem for renting properties. But that is completely untrue. That is not the way markets work, because once a regulation is enforced, the whole level playing field just goes up a little. One property isn't performing any better or worse than the other if that happens, and there is no grounds for one landlord increasing rents more than another. So market competition simply means that the market can bear a certain amount, and that's the amount that will determine the rent, not whether the properties are being improved in terms of their insulation standards. So for that reason, I don't accept the National Party members' arguments either. What does, of course, increase rents is house prices, and rents are based on recovery of the cost of capital of houses. And that today is what is really driving rent increases, and anybody with half an ounce of common sense knows that if we continue to get the magnitude of house price increases that we are currently getting, then inevitably that is going to push rents up and up and up, and little or no proportion of those rent increases will come from any requirement for improved insulation standards. Now, that's the truth of the situation there. I think that the National Party's arguments in terms of those exemptions, what they effectively are from current standards for 1978 properties, is simply unacceptable. And in fact, if the government really was, Mr Chairman, if the government really was concerned about rent increases arising from a requirement to improve insulation standards of properties built after 1978 to current standards, then why would they not, for example, allow landlords to expense the whole of the cost of that upgrade in the year that the expense was actually incurred? If that was done, then what we would see is landlords wanting to do this voluntarily. whether it was required in the regulations or not. And Mr Chairman, I know that's the case because I have talked to, Mr Chairman, I have talked
Dennis
to...
O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I have talked to representatives of the landlords organisation, and they have said that to me, that for a certain specified number of particular improvements, like insulation, like improved heating facilities in homes, if they were allowed to expense those costs in the year, fully in the year that they were incurred, then those people would invest much more readily and much more willingly in the improvements to their homes. So if the government really is concerned about those issues, then that's the sort of thing they would do about it, but we're not seeing that. So I don't accept at all the arguments that the Minister and the other speakers from the other side of the House have put up against, over time, requiring all properties to meet what we are calling now the 2008 insulation standards. There should be no difference whenever the property was improved or whenever it was built. Now, what I would say is this, that it would be reasonable if a property was built after 1978, because the insulation standards were better than before 1978, I would think it would be reasonable to have a longer period of time for compliance for properties built after 1978, maybe 7 or 8 years, something like that. But it shouldn't be forever. There should be a period within which all landlords know that today's standards, the 2008 standards, are the standards that ultimately they will be required to have. And furthermore, as technologies improve, we should improve those standards, and landlords should continue to have to meet those standards within a reasonable period of time, no matter what those standards are and no matter when a property was built. That has got to be the objective. Uniform standards for all properties so that we get this very essential requirement for insulation at the highest achievable standard we can in New Zealand. And of course, that won't be enough by itself. And I want to refer lastly to SOP 172, because the part of that I particularly want to see is that heating and ventilation must also be subjected to minimum requirements for performance of a property in terms of heating and ventilation. Not just a list that space heating, for example, should be required, but what the standard actually is. There's not much point in having very good insulation standards without similar standards for performance of heating systems and for performance of ventilation. That shouldn't, of course, only apply to rental properties. We have to try and see that those standards get met throughout New Zealand's housing stock as soon as possible. Because as others said, the cost savings and the avoidance of illness, the avoidance of a whole raft of social problems that arise from these lack of standards in New Zealand are a fundamental problem we have to address in this country and try and get ourselves much closer to the kind of standards you see in North America in particular and in parts of Europe. So we need to aspire to that much. So that's why I think I'm so disappointed, Mr Chairman, in this piece of legislation, because it really doesn't go far enough. The Minister has criticised other parties for wanting to go too far. He should look in the mirror and see that the real problem is not them, it is him for not wanting to go far enough.
I call Sir William Seal.